Welcome, everyone. My name's Saraswati, and I'm here in YogaKula in Berkeley, California. And we're very excited to be speaking with Doug Keller today. And I'm sure several of you know Doug. We're very excited to be hosting him coming quite soon here for an online workshop on January the 20th. Today, where I'm going to ask Doug a few questions about the topic of subtle body and yoga. So one of the questions I had, Doug, could you talk to us about when you're understanding the anatomy of the subtle body, how it helps you to go deeper into your yoga practice?
I actually wanted to start with one technical point that ultimately doesn't make a difference, but it's for the purists, because the Sanskrit term that's used for the subtle body going way back is the Sukshma Sharira. And that actually refers to that aspect of ourself that transmigrates from one body to the next and is made up of different tattvas, and it doesn't actually have any form of its own. And that's the sort of body that Patanjali is trying to bring to an end through the state of samadhi. When you enter samadhi, you no longer have any involvement in the tattvas or the gunas. And that's usually not what we're talking about. When we're talking about the subtle body, what we've gotten accustomed to talking about is this whole network of nadis in the body, and the nexuses of this network of flows of prana is represented by the chakras. And they also use other terms like granthis in some perspectives. And it's meant to be very evocative terminology. It brings you, as you're suggesting, into a deeper experience of the self by tuning into this flow of prana that flows through the nadis. So even though it's not, technically proper to speak of it as the subtle body, they spoke of it as the yoga body or the inner body. We've gotten so accustomed to calling it the subtle body that we'll just call it that. I think it works on actually a number of levels. I mean, one thing that happened with the advent of modern yoga is this idea that yoga or yoga language shifted away from talking about the subtle body and the nadis and the chakras and the subtle inner experiences, and focused on the physical body in terms of muscles and stretching and asana practice. And so asana practice became emphasized as if there's sort of like a dividing line between the two experiences, where asana becomes so physical that it kind of excludes the subtle experience of the nadis. And by the same token, if you get into the experience of the nadis, it takes you out of, or it takes you into a different realm than doing the physical yoga. But I've been looking at the nervous system and how the nervous system works. And with modern understanding of that, the function of the autonomic nervous system, neuroplasticity, how we go through the process of learning, how we work with our emotions, self-regulation that takes place through different practices. And I've come to understand, or at least it seems to me, that the dividing line between the subtle body and what we think of as the, objectively verifiable physical body becomes more and more blurred on a number of different levels, such that our physical practice of asana does have an influence upon these subtle inner states or inner kinds of awareness. And by the same token, the more we focus with our inner awareness through the different tools of meditation, pranayama, and basically interoception, that takes our asana practice deeper. And so one kind of can't live without the other. And that's sort of the original inspiration behind the Hatha Yogis, that without Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, the yoga of meditation, without Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga, you can't go very deep. And Hatha Yoga without Raja Yoga is kind of meaningless because it remains simply physical. And so I think the whole process of being aware of the flow of prana through the nadis and using the chakras as focal points for our awareness is really essential to deepening both practices, both the inner work of meditation, or the sort of inner yoga, and the work that we do in the body physically. And when we look at the idea of chakras and nadis, going back to the time when it came to be developed, which is really the time of the advent of Hatha Yoga. And prior to that, the Vajrayana tradition and different traditions of Tibetan tantric Buddhism started to really explore the experience of the nadis. There is an interesting distinction where the chakras were always understood to be tools for focus. They were in the realm of the imagination. You pictured, you visualized the chakras, you located that visualization in different areas of the body, and that was meant to evoke a deeper inner experience of a truth that was underlying there that's not the same as what you visualize, but it kind of teases forth that emotional quality or that sort of deeper quality of consciousness that's contained behind that chakra. So the chakras were never considered to be something real or concrete. We know this because within all these different systems, there are all these different enumerations of chakras. Even within schools, different teachers had different enumerations of the chakras within tantric yoga or tantric philosophy, as well as the Hatha yogis. The Hatha yogis basically settled upon one system that was sort of canonized of the 6 chakras with the 7th on top. But even then, Hatha yoga started out with 5 chakras and then had more and less, all of which suggests that there was no sense that you're concretely locating a distinct number and location of chakras in the body. They were tools for practice. But by the same token, when it came to nadis and the experience of a nadi, and the nadi is a Sanskrit term that means a river or a pathway or a flow of pranic energy, those are actually treated as concrete, as experiential. It's something that you can clearly feel within the body itself. And I've always held that, at least in modern terminology, the fascia is the locus of the nadis. Where we experience the flow of prana through the nadis is experienced through the fascia. And so this becomes the meeting point between physical practice, working with muscles and connective tissue and movement, and the subtler inner practice in the sense of an influence upon our nervous system.
Yeah, because you're doing this, I wonder if you could, what is the subtle body? What does it include also?
Yeah, the subtle body, the subtle body, as we come to understand it now, consists of a network of energy centers linked by conduits of energy, or nadis, none of which are actually seen by the eye, but are felt experientially. The nexes we're using visualization for the chakras themselves, especially through meditation practices and breath practices. So it's sort of an imagined structure in which the chakras are the meeting points of the nadis that are used as a focus for visualization. And this slide is making the point that there's really no standard system of chakras. Each school has its own system. But again, it's a way of centering and focusing the mind to elicit an experience. And this is pointed out, I quote the book here, The Secrets of the Vajra World by Reginald Ray, which is about Vajrayana yoga. He points out, and this is within Vajrayana, which is prior to the Hatha yogis, there's a great number of variation in the systems of chakras, but the nadis are not treated in the same way as imagined structures. They're more experientially real within the body. And I think this is where we shade into speaking of the nadis in terms of the nervous system, understanding that a nadi is not simply a nerve. It's not simply a physical structure in the body, though the physical nerves are part of our experience of the nadis. There's a whole qualitative dimension to the nadis that includes an emotional flavor to our experience of the body. It's through the nerves that we have the experience of the body itself, but it's also through the nerves in the fascia that we get messages about our emotional states. And these are often described in very visceral terms. When you're feeling love, you have butterflies in your stomach, or your heart feels light. When you feel anxiety, your stomach gets tied up in knots. It's often a physical message that we feel within the fascia that gives us a clue to or an insight into the state of our nervous system that we come to interpret as an emotional state. You feel a certain thing in the body, And then you try to put a label on it, say, well, I must be feeling anxiety, I must be feeling fear, I must be feeling love or anticipation. Often the sensations of the body are so complex that it's hard to put a single label on it. People say, I'm feeling a lot of things right now, so much so that I don't know what I'm feeling. But my point here is there's a physical interface between our emotional world and what we're feeling in the physical body as transmitted it to us through the nerves of the body. And by nerves, I'm talking not just about the nerves of sensation that are located in the tissues of the body, like the sense of touch and pressure and temperature and so on, but also the nerves located in the deeper viscera of the body. And so there's a physical side and there's a subtle side. So you've got Tom Meyer's book about the myofascial meridians, which has become over time kind of the canon of starting to understand the relationship of fascia to asana practice. And in that, he describes myofascial lines or connections between muscles that allow muscles to coordinate with each other to produce movement. Depending upon the kinds of muscles that we activate for movement, it has an effect upon the nervous system. You've got muscles in the back body running through the spine, to the hamstrings, to the calves, to the soles of the feet, that when they activate, they bring us upright and make us to be alert and present. So when you hop out of bed in the morning, those muscles activate and you're ready to go. So they're very much associated with the sympathetic nervous system. And often the sympathetic nervous system is described in terms of fight or flight or a kind of stress response to some kind of threat. And that's true when we get overly stimulated by a threat, we go into a fight or flight response, which I think of as being basically rajasic. But I think it's unfair to that aspect of our nervous system just to describe it in terms of this sort of crisis mode of fight or flight. Whenever we're present, alert, interested, curious, inquisitive, that's a stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system, which makes us to be fully present and engaged in what's happening. Of course, that's balanced out by the parasympathetic nervous system, which keeps us centered. So in the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic, we're always finding a sort of sattvic balance between being interested, engaged, active, outgoing, and at the same time remaining centered and calm. And so we don't go into the extremes of reaction. We maintain our basic homeostasis or biological function. And so to put it simply in terms of asana, depending upon the muscles that are activated in asana practice, it sends different messages to the nervous system, which brings us into the stimulated state of presence or calms us down into a state of being centered. And we're always balancing the action of these muscles between sympathetic and parasympathetic to find this middle place of centeredness and balance. And I think, as we'll get into in the workshop, it's helpful to bring in the idea of the vayus, which are the different powers of prana that go back to the time of the Upanishads. It's actually a very early idea and conception of the body, and it helps us to understand the different dimensions of our nervous system, which go beyond simply stimulation and relaxation, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and starts to get into the other deeper functions of the body, which are illustrated on the right here, centered around primarily, but simplistically, but centered around the vagus nerve, which are the two branches of a central nerve of the autonomic nervous system that starts at the brainstem, goes down into the body, and insinuates itself into the deeper organic functions of the body, going down deep into the gut, monitoring what we're feeling within the gut, as well as going into the heart, the breath. It's a deeper system for checking into our inner states. When we combine breath with movement and asana, we start to check into these deeper levels of awareness, but it's also something that we explore even more deeply through pranayama practice and through meditative practice, especially through the tools of the chakras. When the chakras are associated with asana practice, I think that's dealing with chakras on a kind of superficial level, and it leads to superficial statements like, well, when you do a back bend, you open the heart chakra. Or when you do this asana, it opens this chakra, that chakra. On a certain level, in terms of stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, for example, could be true, but it doesn't really get into the depth of what the chakras are about or the kind of interoception that they get us engaged in. To understand that deeper level of the subtle body, which is what you're originally asking about, we go into the level of the vagus nerve and checking in on different levels of awareness in the body and what the body is telling us about our inner emotional states and how we're able to relate how we deal with our emotional states to the centeredness of the spiritual self, which is kind of the heart of the yoga practice that we do. And you notice what the Hatha yogis bring into yoga practice is this idea of the two nadis, the Ida and the Pingala, the two nadis that are stimulated by the breath through the nostrils. This is speaking very directly to, I think, the function of what the vagus nerve is actually doing in the body as a deeper way of regulating and modulating our nervous system and the states of our nervous system. Early senses of yoga were about controlling the mind and senses. There was the metaphor of the chariot that was used in the Katha Upanishad, where the body and the senses are like the horses drawing the chariot, and the mind provides the reins by which you control the senses, and then the intellect is what directs the mind to control the senses. It's all centered around control or self-control. You get the sense with Patanjali, where he talks about calming the thought waves of the mind. It's about controlling or silencing or quieting the thought waves of the mind. I think this changes with the Hatha yogis, first of all, because there's this deeper understanding that what you're looking to master are the states of the nervous system out of which thoughts arise. If you simply try to control the mind or quiet the mind, you won't have as much success because the thoughts of the mind arise out of the states of the nervous system. So if you're in a very agitated state, it's very hard to control the agitated thoughts that come out of that agitated state. If you simply try to cancel the thoughts, you don't change the very source of the thoughts. And so the tantrics and the Hatha yogis are saying, let's look at how we tune into the states of the nervous system and make a shift in the states of the nervous system such that we're better able to not only calm the mind, but actually use the mind productively. And in connection with that, I think Patanjali has an insight that he kind of leaves behind. Because on the one level, Patanjali is talking about quieting the thoughts of the mind or calming the thoughts as if the chitta-vrittis are just things going on in the mind. But he does have an insight into how much this is the product of states and habits based upon previous experience. The chitta-vritti are actually not just discrete thoughts or vibrations of thought. Vritti means to rotate or to turn or to go on circles. So the problem of the mind is how much the mind repeats itself according to the patterns that it has established. And so our problem is most of the thoughts of our mind are the same thoughts that we were thinking yesterday and the day before. That's what gives the sense of solidity to the ego, or a sense that my sense of self, as an ego, is very concrete. It's because I'm thinking the same thoughts over and over and over again. And the attempt of the yogi is actually to kind of try to break that cycle, or basically break the habit of thinking in certain ways. And this speaks to actually two kinds of memory that we function by. The one kind of memory that we have is what we basically tell ourselves to remember. And so the basis of practice is repetition. If you want to learn a language, you have to repeat the practice of the language day after day after day, making this effort. And when Patanjali is talking about effort, he's talking about a practice as effort, as abhyasa, as repetition. This speaks to the certain kind of memory by which you build a pattern so that a skill which initially takes effort in the beginning, eventually becomes effortless to you, and it becomes second nature or habit to you. And so when Patanjali is talking about practice, he's speaking along those lines of practice as repetition to establish certain patterns in the way that we think, so that those patterns become pretty much natural to us. There's another kind of memory that he touches upon when he's talking about samskaras, and he describes the different kleshas: ignorance, egoism, attachment, aversion, and fear. Whenever we experience stress because of a threat to one of those concerns or those kleshas, it has an emotional impact upon us. And so when we have a certain experience, we remember the experience because of the emotion behind it. And this is a different kind of memory. When we have a traumatic memory, we increase the trauma by thinking the memory again and again and remembering the emotion that goes with it. And so in that sense, that trauma can be reinforced through repetition. But every time we remember an experience, how we remember it, especially if it's a strongly emotional experience, how we remember it is colored by the emotional state that we're in now as we remember that experience. And we can either reinforce the trauma aspect of that memory, making it stronger with each repetition, or we can replace that emotion with a different emotion and thus alter that memory. And in altering these samskaras, we alter the way in which we experience the world, the way in which we see the world. And so our vision of our present experience and our vision of what our experience will be in the future, how we anticipate the future, how we fear the future or look forward to the future, all of that is colored by our samskaras. And those samskaras, we're coming to understand, get buried very deep in the body, particularly in the area of the gut. And the whole nervous system surrounding the gut is really, it's treated as a second brain. It has its own intelligence because the gut is the primary place of our interface between the outer world and the inner world, especially by the food that we take in. And also along with the food that we take in, the different invaders that come into our body in the form of germs and viruses. And so a lot of our immune system is centered around the gut, and we've got a rapid response system within the gut to any kind of invader, whether it's food poisoning or germs, things that attack our immune system. Without the brain directing it, the gut sets off the immune system to fight these invaders. And this also has an emotional level to it too. When we feel threatened by an outside threat, we have a gut response to that. And that response, which manifests in the form of a release of hormones, such as adrenaline, if you're in a threatening experience. So you've got sympathetic nervous system putting you into fight or flight mode, but where you feel it is in the gut, releasing adrenaline, preparing you for that sort of fight or flight. This gets embedded within the intelligence of the gut as a kind of reflex, an emotional reflex, or in other words, a samskara. And this pattern will repeat itself when we face the same stimulus in the future. We have the same gut response that we had in the past. In order for us to overcome those samskaras, we have to be aware of that gut reflex. We have to be aware of what's happening inside, such that we actually have the space in which we can change or alter our response. We can start to undo the samskara. And Patanjali had his own sorts of responses to samskaras, especially the yamas in particular, are ways of shortcutting the samskara. For instance, with ahimsa, the response of violence. Why would we react violently to somebody? It must be because we feel some kind of threat that makes us have this reflex of responding violently. If you follow the principle of ahimsa, then you basically say no to that violent response, and you start to disengage the stimulus from the response such that you start to overcome that habit of reacting. The more you say no to violence, the more you say no to that gut reaction to fear or to threat, and you start to undo the power of the samskaras. So I think Patanjali had a good initial understanding of working with that whole mechanism. And it's interesting how, on the one hand, he speaks of practice as repetition in terms of meditative repetition. And on the other hand, he has an awareness of the whole functioning of samskaras, but he doesn't quite clearly bring the two together, except by essentially advising yoga as being a form of disassociation or withdrawal from the stimulus that brings those responses. So you not only follow the yamas to reduce the responses to the samskaras, you start to absent yourself from the world such that you're no longer pulled into that sort of stimulus response engagement. I think the Hatha yogis started to develop a much more insightful system for being engaged in the world and dealing with what comes up inside. And the pathway of communication between the self and our sort of inner body or subtle body, and the subtle body is the place where we have these experiences, where we have these samskaras, where we have these knots or grunties or blocks. We need to be in communication with that inner self in order to modulate a response and basically build better habits and patterns for dealing with the world outwardly, as well as going deeper inside inwardly. And so they started to introduce this idea of the nadis. I mean, notice in Patanjali, there's only one point at which he talks about the nadis, which is in conjunction with the Kurma nadi, very, very briefly. And it's in the context of supernatural powers. Even in the Bhagavad Gita, when there's any discussion of breath control or nadis, it has to do with the achievement of supernatural powers. It's disconnected from the kind of yoga that's being discussed in the Bhagavad Gita itself. So there's this whole realm of the nadis that gets set aside for a long period of time, both in the Bhagavad Gita and in Patanjali, in favor of a different approach to spirituality. When you come to the Hatha yogis in Tantra, they start to reincorporate this idea of the nadis as being essential to establishing the communication between the inner body, the subtle body, and the self that's at the center of the subtle body. Even going back to the Katha Upanishad, where they locate the self as being within the heart, and from that self in the heart flows the system of nadis that allows us to be conscious of the body. To make sense of how this works on different levels, I think it's important to really understand what the Vayus were about. And again, the Tantrics and Hatha yogis are reaching back to the early Upanishads, pulling forward this idea of Vayus and revivifying this idea to give a deeper understanding of what the chakras are about. Because I think our understanding of the chakras is really centered in our understanding of how the Vayus function within the body. And here we move from the sort of physical movement of the body, which has to do with Vyanavayu that I'll talk about in a moment. Once we move beyond Vyanavayu, which is sort of the realm of asana practice, and start to go deeper into the breath, as connected with movement and asana, but also as connected with going into deeper states of meditation, then we start to go into deeper realms of the Vayus and start to understand what the chakras are about.
Yeah, just back to the Vayus too. If like, how is a Hatha yogi or someone who's practicing, why would being aware of the Vayus be helpful in your practice?
Because I think it's a metaphorical way of speaking about all of the levels of functioning of the autonomic nervous system that go from mental function to physical function to pain management to the immune system to our emotional life and the emotional patterns that we build up and the sorts of reactions that are built out of those emotional reflexes. That can be understood in modern terms on the level of the nervous system, and particularly the autonomic nervous system. I think we've gotten a taste of that with COVID because all of the symptoms of long COVID that people are dealing with post-COVID are really different forms of dysfunction in the autonomic nervous system, leading to problems with autoimmune diseases or autoimmune symptoms, to brain fog, to inflammation in the body, and other forms like that. All of that's related to the autonomic nervous system. And I think the Vayus speak to that on many different levels. And the idea of the Vayus gives us an opportunity for focus in our practice to really balance the response of the nervous system on a mental as well as emotional and physical level, so that as a whole we function better.
Yeah, just a broad strokes values, if you could explain a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll hop in and give an example starting with Vyanavayu. Vyanavayu is the quote I mentioned. It's also in the Prajna Upanishad about locating the spiritual self within the heart, from which radiate all of these nadis, or here the translation is nerves, which expand out to like 72,000 nerves. And the point of this passage is it says, in all of these nadis moves Vyana, which is the fourth prana or the fourth Vayu. And so this is the meaning of Vyana Vayu is expanding or pervasive awareness. And it really flows through the nerves of the body as illustrated on the right, both the spinal nerves and as well as some of the cranial nerves, basically giving consciousness to the body in terms of sensation and pain awareness. Vyanavayu suggests a sort of integrated awareness of our outer actions with our inner states, meaning that certainly Vyanavayu is the pathway by which we move the body. But when you see a person in a certain emotional state, it also manifests in the person's body. When somebody is very much in love, their skin is very rosy and flush because the very circulation of the skin opens up because of that emotional state. When somebody's very much afraid, their skin turns pale and white because all the circulation drains away from the skin. All of this is a function of Vyanavayu, which is linked into not only our intentions for movement, but it also reflects our inner emotional state. Vyanavayu has to do with all kinds of movement in the body, which includes the feeling of the movement of the breath, the circulation of the blood, how it circulates in connection with emotional states, like I mentioned. It has to do with the lymphatic system and how the body cleanses itself of dead cells, as well as different invaders that have been dealt with by the immune system. Vyanavayu is about the whole space of the body in which these move, as well as the subtler movements of thought, intention, and emotion that have a physical manifestation through Vyanavayu. So Vyanavayu has very much to do with consciousness, physical consciousness, and sensation. And the message is that how we practice the asana can actually inform or even alter our emotional states. If you're feeling fear and you feel you're curled up into a fetal position out of fear and anxiety, to practice asanas that activate the muscles that open up the body, ground the body, steady the body, can actually, through this sort of loop of communication between the physical body and the nervous system, change the state of the nervous system so you come out of that state of anxiety. And it's through practicing different actions, you can actually start to rewire the brain. And so you start to associate movements with emotional states that allow you to overcome emotional states that you don't want to be in, or emotional states that are producing thoughts that you'd rather not be having, or thoughts that drag you down. So it's a two-way street from nervous system to body and from body to nervous system. And this loop is maintained especially through the vagus nerve, because the vagus nerve communicates the states of the body back to the brain, and then the brain adjusts accordingly. That's one level of the nervous system in which the vagus nerve is involved, but there are deeper levels, as I've been suggesting, to the vagus nerve and how it insinuates itself into the deeper levels of function in the body. You can actually divide three areas. There's the part of the vagus nerve that you can see starts from the brainstem, but is very much centered around the organs of breath, like the nose, the throat, the organs of vocalization. That's one level of vagus nerve that actually starts to correspond with the chakras we associate with the throat, ability of expression, as well as the higher chakras, the space between the eyebrows, as well as the sensations through the nostrils. All of this has to do with focusing mental clarity and expressing our mental clarity through speech. A second level is the area from the collarbone to the area above the diaphragm, which is the area of the heart chakra interfacing into the throat chakra. This is where the vagus nerve is checking into the state of your heart, what the heart is doing. Is it beating fast? Is it calm? What's the state of the diaphragm? How is the diaphragm moving? It's interesting, the diaphragm does not have a lot of nerves in it to tell you when it's contracting and releasing. That's why it's very hard to teach diaphragmatic breath to people, because you don't feel your diaphragm working. You feel the manifestation of the diaphragmatic breath. You feel how the belly opens a little bit, the lower ribs open a bit as you breathe in and the diaphragm contracts, and how the belly relaxes inwards and the ribs relax inwards with the exhalation. You're feeling the manifestation of the movement of the diaphragm, but you're not feeling the action of the diaphragm itself. But the vagus nerve is checking into the activity of the diaphragm, even though we don't physically feel the action of the diaphragms. And from that information relays back to the autonomic nervous system what your inner state is. If you're breathing with the chest and not the diaphragm, the message is that you must be in a sympathetic state of arousal because you're chest breathing too much and you're not in a relaxed state of breathing with the diaphragm. And from that communication loop, the autonomic nervous system adjusts to that state, releasing hormones such as adrenaline, so on and so forth, that reinforce that inner state. So this is a place where the vagus nerve checks into the state of this part of the body. And you can think of the heart chakra as being a central focus for interoception or inner awareness, by which you reestablish this loop of communication between mind and body. Because when there's a lack of communication, if you have a habit of chest breathing, the message that's constantly getting sent to the nervous system is one of hyperventilation and panic. And so you can get stuck in a heightened sympathetic state and have a hard time getting out of it and not know why you're in this state of anxiety. Once there is communication, it's like, wow, I'm breathing with my chest, my heart is beating fast, then you can come into a strategy for changing that pattern, starting to drop into diaphragmatic breath, starting to pay attention to the sensation of the breath. This allows you to calm down into a parasympathetic state. And then there's a third level, the deepest level, below the diaphragm, which is this level of the gut that I was talking about. And most of the hormones in the body that influence the states of the body, again, adrenaline is the most obvious example, but there are all kinds of hormones that have different effects upon the sensation of the organs that reflect our emotional states. It's the sort of gut reflex that's built into, shall we say, there's some scars in the gut that releases different hormones that put us in different physical emotional states in the body that affect the states of the mind. The fibers of the vagus nerve communicate back to the brain what's going on in the gut. And so when you feel your gut, your stomach tied up in knots, that's often an emotional reflex based on previous experience. And that releases different hormones of anxiety that make the body feel anxious because of that sensation. And then the thoughts of the brain start to reflect that. How do you undo that cycle of reaction? Well, it's only by being aware of this response happening in the body, through being in touch with what's going on in the gut, that the brain can start to fashion a response to break that pattern. So there has to be a way of checking into what's happening in the body instead of disassociating from it. And this is where you get to the deeper levels of the chakras, the navel chakra, the lower belly, even going down to the pelvic floor. You can see from this simplistic illustration of the vagus nerve, the branches of this nerve go deep down, all the way down to the pelvic floor to tell us what we're feeling and what's going on inside. 80% of the information that flows from the vagus nerve goes from the nerves in the gut back to the brain. 20% is devoted to the brain's response in altering that reaction of the gut. And so the locations of the vayus, I'm putting it out simply here, and we'll go into a little bit deeper detail in the workshop itself. Udana Vayu has to do with vocalization, expression, and the power of our intention, which also has to do with intentionally directing the breath. So this is very much related to throat chakra and ajna chakra, which is understood through Udana Vayu. And lack of cognitive clarity, brain fog, is experienced as a symptom of dysfunction at this level of the autonomic nervous system, which means a dysfunction in Udana Vayu. And you can make a shift through practices, particularly of intentionally directing the breath through pranayama, as well as through the practice of mantra or vocalization. Pranavayu is that level of stimulation of heart and diaphragm, having to do particularly with sympathetic stimulation, very much located within the heart, and also starting to get into the area of will, or the kind of stubbornness of will that's represented by the navel. The area below the diaphragm represents these other vayus. Apana Vayu is usually presented as the counterpoint to Pranavayu. If Pranavayu is stimulation, which can tend into overstimulation, then Apana Vayu is the function of grounding and centering, letting go and letting be. So it's often associated with the lower body, down even below the navel, having to do with the organs of elimination. And this also suggests our immune system, how we respond to invaders in the body and rid ourselves of those invaders. How do we kill the germs within the body and then expel those germs? How do we expel waste products from the body? Everything that we don't need is taken care of by Apanavayu. And it's associated with this calming response. Something that I find fascinating is it's been pointed out that babies, as we start out, are hardwired for a sympathetic response. They're very reactive to the outer world, whether getting interested in giggling about the outer world or starting to cry and shriek when something upsets them. It's very easy for a baby to go into a sympathetic response of being spun up. The response of bringing yourself back down again, which is essentially Apanavayu, is something that we learn. It's a learned response. It's not built in. So how we are calmed down by our primary caregivers teaches us how to engage our own system of Apanavayu, how to soothe ourselves and bring ourselves back to a state of being centered. This is learned behavior, whereas the sympathetic response is automatic. It's not learned. And so a lot of the practices of yoga are focused upon reinforcing this learned behavior by which we soothe ourselves, calm ourselves, and come back to our center, while still at the same time being engaged in the outer world. So this is the balance between Pranavayu and Apanavayu, which is the two most familiar vayus. And it goes down to the lower chakras, especially even Muladhara chakra, this sense of safety, of being grounded, of being centered. And then there's Samanavayu, which suggests the balance between prana and apana. Sama basically means equilibrium. And it's at the center of the autonomic nervous system, the way in which we maintain organic balance in the body, which is called homeostasis, by the proper release of hormones in the body. Our digestive system functions optimally in an emotional state. Our immune system functions optimally through the regulation of the immune system as well as hormones. All of this is a balancing act that's carried out by Samanavayu, which is very much linked into our gut awareness and also supports the power of will. So it's located more around the area of the navel and speaks to this whole inner intelligence of the enteric nervous system, or a sort of gut intuition. If you accept the chakra system, the sort of 6 chakras with the Sahasraras perhaps being the 7th, how you focus in on the body by focusing in on the chakras with the breath, with our awareness, with our imagination, is supporting the loop of communication by which the vagus nerve, through the pathways of these 2 nadis, checks into our inner state and allows this harmony of self-regulation between the self and the body, where the body speaks to the self and the self speaks back to the body. The practices of Hatha Yoga, from asana to pranayama to meditation, which includes dharana, focusing upon chakras, and deeper forms of meditation that we enter into through this source of interoception, is all built upon reinforcing this circuit or this connection of communication by which we function better and more fully. And with that harmonious function, it becomes that much easier to enter into deep states of meditation, to come closer to the true self without the kinds of blocks or obstacles or knots or grunties that the Hatha yogis described as blocks to this flow of communication. And so you find the Hatha yogis talking about purificatory practices like Nadi Shodhana. What they mean by those terms are overcoming the blocks to communication between body and self, which get in the way of being able to achieve deeper states of self-awareness, that harmonize our emotional states with our mental states, such that we can achieve that state of quietness, the essence of the meditative state, and from that centered state to be able to function outwardly in the world. What I've been presenting here is kind of like the big picture. What I'll be doing in the workshop is going to refer to this, but at the same time, it's going to be more practical, because we're going to go through different movement exercises, both focusing on how different kinds of asanas activate different myofascial lines or nadis in the body in a way that influences different states of awareness, whether it's sympathetic, parasympathetic, and how you find balance through asana practice. That's kind of like on the physical level of asana related to Meyer's myofascial lines that are mentioned, but also starting to get into breath practices, looking at the movements of the spine that modulate and support the movement of the breath. There are movements of the spine that support the movement of the diaphragm, that influence the states of the psoas, and which also influence deeper states of awareness. There's this transition from physical movement into deeper states that takes place through the medium of the breath. The breath on both a physical level and also the sort of emotional level of the inner qualities of the nervous system that come about through different kinds of focus upon the movement of the breath. So we get into different pranayama practices that help to alter these inner emotional states. So the workshop, which is more extended than what I did today, is going to get into experiential practices step by step to see how these different practices actually have a palpable effect upon our inner states and support our yoga.
And you just started to talk too more about this idea that using the practices of awareness of meditation practice, visualization, pranayama. But also I wanted to ask about the effect of different asanas, how that can shift our inner state as well. And I'm sure you'll cover that more in the workshop.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, in this, at the simplest level, what I described as the balance between prana and apana is the most obvious effective asana practice. And there are certain actions which are opening, such as actions that open the chest. It has to do with the psoas. And then there are actions that are grounding, the actions that take place through the tailbone and the pelvic floor. It's a very simple example, and we'll expand upon that as you get into different practices like twists and other poses, how the balance of the actions by which we achieve those poses also has subtler and deeper effects upon the nervous system beyond simply sympathetic and parasympathetic, getting into these qualities of equilibrium or samana vayu, or this sense of energetic expression, which is Udana Vayu, or the sense of presence in the body, which is Vyana Vayu. So the practices will be linked to the experiential qualities of the different Vayus, and the Vayus, the awareness of these qualities of the Vayus, become the doorway into understanding the experience of the chakras and the sort of intention behind the focus upon the chakras, which alters our inner states.
And you think of modern day teachers who might teach in the gym, yoga is just seen as this fitness thing where you might come in, have a good sweat and walk out down into the street and have no idea of what's available in our practice. And also the importance as a teacher to realize, yes, there's the outer body anatomy, but there's also all these different layers of inner body anatomy. And
I think there was an appreciation on the part of the Hatha yogis, which was not present in yoga before that, on a couple levels. First of all, I hesitate to use the word fitness because that only connotes some things, but health that is supported through movement and activity is essential to the health of the nervous system and essential to the very health of the system by which we achieve states of meditation or have this deeper interception. Our brain functions better when we move the body and keep the body healthy. So asana becomes important in a way that was never really appreciated before. Early forms of asana, going way back to early yoga, were forms of asceticism. They were forms of self-punishment to burn up karma. They weren't concerned with the connection between the health of the body and the health of the mind and emotional health. And on a second level, again, in a way that had never been talked about before, this focus upon the health of the digestive system, which is not just having, not having an upset stomach so you can meditate. It's an understanding of how much our deep emotional life and the sorts of blocks and resistances that we encounter in our spiritual life are very much centered in the gut, and the physical health of the gut connected to our emotional health. That connection is so deep and so profound on a level of intelligence that we're not really in touch with, becomes really important to any kind of success in yoga. And so a lot of the asanas were connected with digestive health or refer to digestive health because it's really key and essential to any kind of success with the deeper work, even with the work of the chakras. Really revolutionary insights into our well-being that just were not dealt with on any explicit level in previous philosophies of yoga. So it was really, really important what they were doing.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to the course.
Thank you.
And I hope you guys online can join us.
Yeah, in answer to the one question here, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the nervous system itself. I've kind of skimmed the surface here. But in that aspect, there are going to be illustrated notes like you have here, and there's a question about the charts. And so those notes are going to be available for you to download and refer back to. And we're going to go back and forth between, explicating certain parts of the notes and then going into a little mini set of practices by which to experience what we're talking about, and then take the next step to the next part. So it's going to be a balance between simple practice and understanding of the depth to which the practice is kind of inviting us to explore.